For this video, we'll be discussing the philosophies of China. Now, before we get into the next dynasties to come, it's important that we go over the major philosophies that shaped Chinese culture and government for centuries to come, especially Confucianism. So the three major philosophies that we'll be dealing with in this chapter are Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. Okay, now I'll talk about each one with their founding and their general principles, but it's also important understanding the time frame for which a lot of these philosophies arose and then gained prominence. From 475 to 221, that was known as the period of the Warring States. Now, this emerged after the collapse of the Zhou dynasty that we learned about a couple chapters ago. Even though Confucianism and Taoism, they kind of came about prior to it, they really, kind of started to gain prominence during this time, and legalism directly emerged from it. And the reason being is that this, as you can see from the name of it, the Warring States period, it was a time of constant civil war. There was no true unified centralized government of China. And how is man to live in a world dominated by chaos, suffering, and absurdity? It was for 200 something years. It was a very, very chaotic, stressful time in China. So people were looking for answers. They were looking for ways in which, government could assert itself, in which society could get itself back on track, or maybe in Taoism's case, how people could distance themselves from government. Okay, so first we'll talk about Confucius. Kangfuzi, his actual name is Confucius, is a westernized version of his name. Now, he lived from 551 to 479, so as I said, a little bit before the Warring States period. He was from the Chinese state of Lu in northern China at that time, and he was a teacher and advisor. He was a failed government administrator. He had dreams of rising up the ranks in government, but he realized that people were getting their jobs based more on birth and who they knew as opposed to merits, and he became very disenchanted with it, became very bitter towards it, and so he traveled out and became an educator. His followers, after his death, they collected his works in this collection known as the Analects. Some of his followers, such as Mencius and Shunxi, almost similar to apostles, the way that they collected the Gospels after Christ. But it's very important to not make the mistake of calling Confucianism a religion. Again, this is a philosophy. There's a distinct difference between the two. Now, Confucius is all about practical applications of morals and ethics. Religious concerns really didn't matter to him. It was about the here and now. He didn't even really care too much about the ins and outs of government. It was more about the relationships between government and the people. For Confucius, it was all about social harmony. It was all about people and government and rulers knowing their role and people sticking with it. And if people knew their role and if they kind of aspired to be higher even, for him, another important concept that he talked about was for people, men in particular, to become junsi. These scholarly gentlemen, he said, kind of achieving the best form of themselves in this application of morals and ethics. So, again, philosophy, religion didn't really matter to Confucius. He never talked about the afterlife. He talked about principles that, are similar to some religious principles, but still that part of it was totally separate from his thinking. All right, now the Confucian principles, let's get into these. The first one, Li. Li is propriety. It's about your rules, your rituals. As I said, the things that you're supposed to do is for your proper place within society, and that if people followed it, society would work much smoother and much better as a whole. Another, Ren. Runen is known as benevolence, but another way of putting it is humanity, empathy, okay, being good to one another. It doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to be equal. He didn't believe in the equality of everyone. He did believe in a social hierarchy, but he said that there is no reason that we have to be cruel to each other. Very similar to this concept of Shu, altruism, okay. There's a very famous saying from Confucius, "Do not do unto others what you would not want done to you." Very similar to the golden rule of Christianity. He just threw two knots in there, but the principle is the exact same. So Ren and Shu are very similar in that respect about doing good unto others and, kind of expecting that in return. We also have Yi, righteousness, right? Pretty self-explanatory about doing the right thing. And lastly, Shao. I may be screwing up the pronunciations on some of this a little bit. Shao is about filial piety. Confucius was very, very big on showing respect for your elders. Not only your parents, but for anybody that was older than you. And that would later on become a very, very big part of Chinese society. So make sure you remember that, Shao, filial piety. That was a big part of Confucianism. Now, hopefully you remember this from last year, but your 5 relationships. You have these relationships where you have a superior and an inferior. Ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother. Now, one thing to notice is the only one that includes a female is this one here, husband to wife. And in this one, the husband is designated as the superior. The wife's role was to listen to her husband, to provide for her husband. But it's also important to remember that the superior ones, the ruler, the father, husband, elder brother, they all have responsibilities. The ruler has to look out for the subject. The ruler has to provide laws and stability for the subjects. And in return, the subject will listen to him. Remember that the mandate of heaven was still something that the Chinese people believed in even after Confucianism. So if the ruler, if the dynasty was not doing a good job, it was believed that they lost the mandate of heaven and could rise up against them. So, Confucius kind of worked that into his own principles and saying that the ruler had to do right by the subject, same way that the father had to do right by the son, the husband to wife. But ultimately, the lower ones here, they were expected to be subservient to the upper one. Right? Even elder brother to younger brother. The only one that was on more equal footing was this one, friend to friend. He said for this one, they still had the principles of Ren and Shu could still be applied, of humanity and altruism and so forth. But there was no superior and inferior for those. Now, Confucian social structure, it really wouldn't be a true pyramid. Right? This diagram that I found, it gets put into a pyramid, but it really will just focus on the levels to it as opposed to, the true pyramid shape in the background. Kings and emperors, obviously, they were still up on the top. You're always going to have monarchs being up there. He was a monarchist. He didn't believe in democracy or anything like that. Next, you have scholars. And that'll be important to remember when Confucianism really becomes a huge, huge part of later dynasties about the elitism of the scholar gentry. Now, next, this is always what's kind of interesting. Poor peasants and farmers, they were put next in line. So you think, how is it that poor peasants and farmers? Well, according to Confucius, they were the backbone of society. They were working in the dirt every day, and they were the ones that were making everything happen. So they should be put above even skilled workers and craftsmen, and certainly down here at the bottom, merchants. Merchants, according to Confucius, they took the hard work of others and made profit from it. So therefore, they are not an honorable profession. So they should be down at the bottom. That doesn't mean that merchants couldn't make money. Some merchants just said, "Yeah, I'll live with the fact that I'm not in an honorable profession. And I'm going to get paid." But still, according to Confucian principles, they were at the bottom. And women, Confucianism very much reinforced patriarchal values. Right? We just talked about in the relationships. The only one that included a woman was husband to wife. So women did not have much say in ancient China when Confucianism really took hold. Now, the next one, Taoism. Taoism was founded by Lao Tzu. Sometimes you also see it as Lao Tzu. He was born around 604 BCE. They do not know exactly when he died. And he was known as the Old Master, for obvious reasons. He was old. He was viewed as a master by his followers. Now, some Taoist principles. The first one, the Tao. Right? You'll very oftentimes see it spelled with a T, but it's pronounced more with a D, so it's used interchangeably. The Tao is also referred to as the way. And Tao is a very tricky concept. It's difficult to categorize. It's the way of the universe. Taoists themselves would be very, very hesitant to try and tell you exactly what it means, because trying to do so, they feel, even kind of takes away from this universal spirit, of what makes everything go. They weren't really into that. But ultimately, they said the universe, this way of the universe, it doesn't require you to kind of stand there and kind of get involved too much and try and shape it to your own. It was about being passive. It was about being yielding, about actually doing nothing. A saying was, doing nothing accomplishes everything. Confusing. Some people still consider that to be a contradiction, but, it was a part of their principal beliefs of distancing yourself from everything. Now, because of this, they espoused a oneness with nature, and this could be seen in their artwork. Taoist artwork was big on the landscape paintings about the mountains and the forests and the fields and so forth. It was this real celebration of what the earth has provided us already. Also, this concept of Wu Wei. Wu Wei was about disengagement from society, about taking yourself out of it, particularly when it comes to government. They felt, Wu Wei was about the less government, the better. And it also works in with this belief that laws and society are contrary to the ways of nature, that it hurts nature. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. There was a famous quote by Lao Tzu. So aside from a celebration of nature, there was a real kind of getting back to it and taking yourself out of the laws of society, about taking yourself out of the laws of man. Now, legalism, very, very different from Taoism, whereas Taoism was looked at by modern standards as being more of kind of like a hippie, new agey type of philosophy. Legalism was much more hardcore. Now, Shang Yang and Han Fei Zi are looked at as the two principal legalist philosophers. They both met very rough ends. They were both killed by members of the ruling courts in their respective states, killed by political intrigue. It just shows you a little bit about, the nastiness of the time, but also gives some insight into the legalist philosophy as well. And this became the official philosophy of the Qin dynasty. Now, we'll talk more about that in the next video, but Qin dynasty, big on the legalist principles of strict rules and harsh punishments. Now, legalism itself. Let's get into this one. According to them, human nature is inherently selfish, right? It's not that we are all necessarily evil, but that we are just motivated by self-interest. The reason I chose one of the kids shoving each other is that that's how the government looked at the people. The government needed to be the parent to stop fighting children all the time. Intellectualism, they were not a fan. Okay. They were anti-intellectualism. So thinking for yourself, that was no good. And that had a big impact on writers and scholars. Law, you must live by the rule of law. The law is the supreme authority. People can't go against it. Rulers had to be strong. Rulers had to kind of show strength. That was far and away the most important quality for legalist rulers. We must rule, but with an iron fist. Badass. And for war was the way that people would, that rulers accomplished everything. Rulers gained strength through war, so they should actively go out and seek war. They should build up their militaries and show a force and be able to go out and use it also. All right, so that was a quick primer on the major philosophies. The next video we'll get into talking about the actual dynasties.